Hello learners, I am Dr. Aparna Samudra from the Department of Economics, RTM Nagpur University, Nagpur, and I have been taking you through this course of environmental economics. Today's lecture will be focusing on the various international environment agreements. We'll be talking about the major agreements which have happened at a multilateral level. So, the first thing we will be talking about are that what are the various forms of international agreements, and then we will be discussing these agreements briefly. Now, let us have a background of the various on the need of having international environment agreements. Now, we all know that international environment policy has a distinct character from the national policy. Reason being that different nations are being governed by different governments. Different nations have different perspective about environment, and not only that, different nations get impacted differently by the environmental change. So it has a very distinct character compared to national policy. Not only that, at the international level, the available enforcement mechanisms are much weaker than at the national level because there is no one international court of justice for environment. So it is the various conventions and treaties by which the countries follow the various environmental agreements. Therefore, environmental policy at the international level consists of international agreements among sovereign states where each country pledges to follow certain specified course of action. So, because every country has a different view towards the environment, different resources which they have, it is the only way to put them on the same page is having these agreements where they at least pledge to follow the specific course of action which is decided at the international level. Now, the international agreements can come in various forms. These are the four basic forms in which international agreements come. They can be conventions, they can be protocols, they can be treaties, or they can be bilateral or multilateral agreements. Now, let us have a look at the difference between all these four. We'll start with what is a convention. A convention is an agreement in which countries define a problem and jointly commit to addressing it, but without specifying exactly the concrete steps that will be undertaken to meet its objective. I'll read it once again for you. What is a convention? A convention is an agreement between various nations in which these countries define a problem, that they recognize a problem is there, they define this problem, and then they jointly commit to address this problem. But they will not specify exactly what steps they will be taking to meet these objectives. For example, Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waste and their Disposal of 1989. So, the countries have recognized that this is a problem of movement of hazardous waste. Certain things need to be done to take care of it, but what concrete steps they will be taking, the convention will not talk about it. However, this convention was the first attempt to establish an agreement on global standard of hazardous waste, including the trade and disposal of toxic waste. At least one achievement of Basel Convention we can say was that countries recognized that e-waste is a problem, hazardous waste is the problem. Then how it can be done? They at least agreed on that. The second type of agreement which can happen is called as a protocol. A protocol is an agreement which attempts to fill in some of the details of the convention. So in convention where we just talked about defining the problem, identifying and defining. The protocol goes one step further and it fills in some of the details which were left blank in the convention. It details what specific action and signatories will undertake, what institutions will be established and to implement the agreement, and so on. So it talks about what specific actions will be taken by the signatories, what institutions will be established to implement these agreements, and so on. So wherein in convention only the defining was done, the objectives were laid down, how these objectives will be set, what actions will be taken, what institutions will be established are talked about in the protocol. For example, the Protocol on Water and Health into the 1992 Convention on the Protection and the Use of Transboundary Watercourses and International Lakes and International Legally Binding Agreement for countries in Pan-European region. So, the European region countries have taken a protocol on water and health in 1992 from the convention. Now the treaty, the third type of an agreement. A treaty is a fully developed agreement specifying problems, actions to be undertaken by signatories, steps to be taken under implementation and enforcement, and so on. So treaty is again one step further than the protocol. So a treaty will be talking about, it's a fully developed agreement which specifies problems, actions which need to be undertaken by the signatories of this treaty, steps to be undertaken for the implementation and enforcement also. So the Stockholm Convention, for example, is a global treaty that aims to protect human health and the environment from the effect of persistent organic pollutants. And this particular convention, though it is called, but it is a treaty, it is entered into the force on May 17, 2004. Now we come to the bilateral and multilateral agreements. Bilateral agreement, as the name suggests, it is entered by two countries to manage a particular resource. For example, the Agreement on Environmental Cooperation between India and China was first published in February 1994. This agreement states that the two countries will work together to enhance bilateral cooperation in all areas of environmental activity based on the mutual benefit of the society. So when two countries are coming together and talking about that how a resource will be managed, then we call it as a bilateral agreement. Compared to this is a multilateral agreement wherein number of countries are coming together, or a group of countries is coming together with the objective of managing a resource. A multilateral agreement may also include a regional agreement wherein groups of those countries which are proximal, which are in close proximity to each other or which have a common culture, then their concerns are focused on a resource of local interest. Now, let us see a timeline of the major environmental summits which have resulted in major environmental agreements. The first we have seen earlier also, we started in 1972 with the Stockholm Convention. Then it was the Montreal Protocol in 1987. Then in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was there. This was in the 20th century. As we move to the 21st century, in 2002, there was an agreement in Johannesburg, which was a summit on sustainable development. And the most recent is the Paris Agreement in 2015. Of course, there was another 1992, we had a Rio Conference. Now, let us have a look at the Stockholm Conference 1972. We have already seen a brief overview of this conference. As we all know, the environmental concerns gave momentum when with the emergence of concerns for environment based on scientific evidence of environmental degradation. It was thought that the environmental degradation was going very fast, particularly after the industrialization. Therefore, when scientific evidence emerged that the environment is degrading very fast, or there is global warming which is picking up, the world witnessed this transition. The United Nations, on the insistence of the international community, convened the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in 1972 in Stockholm. Therefore, this particular UN conference is also known as the Stockholm Conference. It was the first major international meeting on the environment and first international environment agreement. The results of the Stockholm Conference were very important. First, it had a non-binding Stockholm Declaration, even though it was non-binding, but a declaration was given by all the member nations who attended this conference. An action plan consisting of 109 recommendations was also done. It established a body under the UN, which is called as the United Nations Environment Programme. And this UNEP was a new UN machinery which served as a catalyst in developing and coordinating an environmental focus on the programs of other organizations. The Stockholm Declaration also laid for the foundation for the future development of international environmental laws. Even if you see in India, whatever environmental regulations or policies started taking shape, they started taking shape after the conference only. Some of the important provisions in this regard were the Principle 11, which talked about implicitly the sustainable development, because this was also the time when we had the Brundtland report, which talked about sustainable development. Principle 21, which said it's the state's responsibility for any transboundary harm. We have already discussed in detail the problem of transboundary environmental issues. And Principle 22 and 24, which talked about the liability. Who will bear the liability for any international damage to the environment? Now, the action plan which was approved in the Stockholm Conference was divided into three categories. One was the Global Environmental Assessment Program, which was a watch plan. Then environmental management activities were there, and then international measures to support assessment and management activities to be carried out at both national and the international level. This is one newspaper cutting which I am showing you, which was at the time of this in 1972. What is the significance of this conference? I'm sure by this time, learners, you must have appreciated that how important this UN conference was. It raised the global awareness of the environmental issues. It also initiated global environmental diplomacy because it talked about transboundary pollution issues. So this is one picture I am again showing where the then Prime Minister of India, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, also attended this conference, and she put in limelight the nexus between poverty and environment. Then after this Stockholm Conference, let me discuss with you the Montreal Protocol, which was in 1987. The Montreal Protocol, entitled as the Montreal Protocol on the Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer, was initially signed in 1987 by 24 countries and the European Community at Montreal, Canada. Therefore, it is called as Montreal Protocol. It was later ratified by 180 countries. Initially, it was signed by 24 countries and the European Community, but then it was ratified by 180 countries. The treaty was designed to protect the ozone layer due to the discovery of the ozone hole. So, in 1987, when the international community became aware of the problem of the ozone hole, it led them to meet and decide that what needs to be done so that this hole doesn't, the ozone layer does not deplete further. The key outcomes of this conference were the phased out production and consumption of ozone depleting substances. So it said that every signatory, as we already seen that later 180 countries ratified it. So it talks about phasing out of production and consumption of ozone depleting substances, which included substances like CFC, halogens, and other related chemicals. The significance is it is considered one of the most successful agreements because it led to the reduction in the ozone layer, ozone depleting substances use, which led to the partial discovery of the ozone layer. Another important international conference or the international agreement happened in Rio Conference in 1992. It was a second major global conference after your Stockholm Conference on the environment. It is also known as the Earth Summit or the UN Conference on Environment and Development. The foremost principle of this conference was to reconcile the worldwide development goals with the need for environmental protection by evolving a sustainable model of development. So, whereas 20 years back in the first conference, the countries recognized that they need to do something about the environment, and we saw in India particularly the enactment of the Air and Water Act, in 1992, it was believed that we cannot just talk about environmental protection. What we need to talk about now is sustainable development. So, sustainable model of development was conceived in this particular conference. The key outcome of the conference is the most important Agenda 21. We have talked about in the previous lectures also. Agenda 21 is basically a comprehensive plan for global sustainable development. It's a 40-chapter action plan to promote sustainable development at local, national, and the global level. It focused on social, economic, and environmental dimensions of sustainability. If we today see the Sustainable Development Goals, and before that we had the Millennium Development Goals, which took shape after the subsequently to the Rio Conference. So they talked about that until we cannot just talk about environment protection. We also need to talk about the sustainable way of life, the sustainable economic development. For that, we have to talk about the sustainability in terms of society, in terms of economics, and in terms of environment. Hence, it emphasized the role of local governments in implementing sustainable development practices. Then we had a Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, which is basically a set of 27 principles which define the rights and responsibility of states in environmental conservation and sustainable development. Some of the key principles of this article of the Rio Declaration consist of Principle 1, which says that human beings are at the center of sustainable development. Principle 2 says states have the right to exploit their own resources but must not harm other states' environment. So you have full right to use your resources, but in this process you have no right to harm this environment of the other states. Principle 15 takes a precautionary approach to the environmental protection rather than the regulatory approach, and Principle 16 talks about the polluters pay principle. What is the significance of Rio Declaration? It brought sustainable development to the forefront of the global policy, and it also created a framework for future environmental treaties. Now, the next thing which we will be talking about is a Kyoto Protocol, which was in 1997. It was adopted on December 11 at Japan. It came into force in 2005. It is a part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it focused on reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions, and it wanted to address, or it aimed to address, the problem of global warming. This is an image of the Kyoto Protocol. It's a conference which happened in Japan. Very important from the point of view of carbon trading. What are the key outcomes of Kyoto Protocol? We have a look. First, the binding of emission targets. In this particular protocol, it made legally binding targets of the emissions for 37 industrialized countries and the European Union. So there was emission targets were set in this particular protocol for the 37 industrialized nations of the world and European nations. These targets aim to reduce emissions of 6 major greenhouse gases like CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, etc. The commitment periods were, that is, they were asked to reduce their emissions by, the first period was from 2008 to 2012. So they were initially given 4 years to reduce their emissions. However, it was later extended through 2020 in the Doha Amendment. So when Doha Amendment happened, it was said that, okay, this emissions should get reduced by 2020. The Kyoto Protocol gave a very flexible mechanism for reduction of the emission targets by allowing countries to trade emission allowances to meet their targets. We have already studied this in detail, that if you are emitting more, you can buy the credits from those who are emitting less. So by this way, what they were trying to do was to balance the emissions in the world. It also talked about CDM, which is the Clean Development Mechanism, which enabled industrial countries to invest in emission reducing projects in developing countries and earn carbon credits. So it basically talked about technology getting transferred from industrialized nation to the less industrialized nations by investing in their emission reducing projects. And in turn, these developed nations or industrialized nations would earn carbon credits, which they could sell in the emission market. It also talked about a joint implementation which allowed countries to earn emission reduction units from projects in other developed countries. So if you are reducing your emissions in one country, you could take the credits to another country where probably the emissions are more. The significance of Kyoto Protocol was it was the first legally binding international treaty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It established a market-based mechanism to achieve emission reductions in a cost-effective way. And it also set the foundation for future climate agreements like the Paris Agreement. Now, this takes us to the Paris Agreement in 2015. It was adopted on December 12 in 2015 at the conference in Paris, France. Therefore, it is called as a Paris Agreement. It came into force in November 4, 2016. What is it? It's a global agreement within the UNFCCC to combat climate change and intensify action and investment needed for sustainable low carbon future. So basically this agreement is focusing on combating climate change by intensifying actions and also increasing the investment which were needed for a sustainable low carbon future. This is again a picture which I have taken to show you the Paris Agreement or COP21, which we call as in your implementation of this greenhouse gas emission. What were the key outcomes? The first was related to the global temperature goal, which aimed, and this particular agreement aims to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And it also is pursuing efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Also, another important outcome was of nationally determined contributions. In your previous lectures, I have given you a small assignment where I asked you to find out that what are the NDCs for India. What are nationally determined contributions, where we have said that each country sets its own targets for reducing GHG emissions, and these NDCs are updated every 5 years with increasing ambition. It also talked about climate finance, which is the keyword buzzword these days. Even in the recent budget, the Honorable Finance Minister has given a taxonomy for climate finance. So that has arisen from the Paris Agreement. So climate finance was a key outcome of the Paris Agreement, where the developed countries committed to provide financial support to the developing countries for mitigation and adaptation efforts for climate change. And the goal is to mobilize 100 billion per year by 2020, which is now extended to 2025. This particular Paris Agreement is also very transparent and talks about accountability by establishing of monitoring, reporting, and verifying countries' progress towards NDCs. So it may so happen that countries in the spur of moment set up very ambitious targets for the NDCs, but if they do not implement it, that is being watched under the Paris Agreement. The significance of the Paris Agreement is it's the first universal, legally binding climate agreement with nearly 200 signatories. It emphasizes both mitigation and adaptation to climate change. It aims to encourage global cooperation and accountability in addressing climate change. So, learners, this is all what we wish to learn from the environmental agreements at the international level. You must have seen that all these agreements at different points of time have influenced India's environmental rules and regulations also. So therefore, it is very important that that there is a global level effort for to correct the environmental damage which has been done by the human beings. And this can only happen when both national and international policies move in consonance with each other. So till then, happy learning. We'll meet soon.